everyone, you're listening to the Audio Study Bible. My name is Jason Hardin. Today I'm going to be reading through Jonah chapter 2 with comment. Last time we looked at Jonah chapter 1, which, just to bring you up to speed, Jonah chapter 1 is all about the unfolding of consequences against Jonah after he refused to obey God's command to go to the city of Nineveh and cry out against it. And the culmination of those consequences was that at the end of chapter 1, Jonah was swallowed by a great fish. And so it is from within that fish that we pick up the story here in chapter 2, verse 1, reading now from the ESV. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. And there's been speculation as to exactly what this fish was. Was this a whale? Probably not. Was it more likely a large shark? That's a possibility. But the text itself does not specify. It simply calls it a great fish in chapter 1 and a fish in chapter 2. But the text does give us four things that this fish does. Number one, it was appointed or designated by God. So notice the text does not say that the fish was spontaneously created uniquely for this event, but rather that it was designated by God. So most likely the fish was already existing in the Mediterranean Sea and was corralled by God for this purpose. Number two, the fish swallows Jonah. Number three, the fish houses Jonah for a period of time, 3 days and 3 nights. This does not mean that it was 72 hours, but just that it was one whole day and then part of the day before and part of the day after. Finally and fourthly, and we haven't got there yet, but the fish at God's command is going to vomit Jonah out onto the dry land. And so the bulk of chapter 2 then is this prayer from Jonah to God from the belly of the fish. And we're going to notice several things about this prayer as we go through. First of all, we're going to notice a repeating pattern of Jonah feeling that he is near death or at death's door, which prompts him to then cry out to God, and then Jonah experiences God's rescue or God's salvation. Another thing you're going to notice as we go through is an excessive use of the first personal pronouns I, me, or my. In fact, there are 25 uses of those personal pronouns in this short 8-verse prayer, which just highlights kind of the self-centered nature of the prayer. And finally, even though the prayer takes place in the belly of the fish, the time period that the prayer is actually describing is the time after Jonah was cast out of the ship and before he was swallowed by the ship, because the prayer itself is actually describing Jonah's near drowning experience at sea. And so we're going to pick up the prayer here in verse 2. Resuming our reading, Jonah prayed, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol, or out of the belly of the realm of the dead, I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Notice here in verse 3, even though it was in fact the sailors who cast Jonah into the sea, here Jonah attributes it to God, recognizing God's sovereignty, and he also says it was your waves and your billows, again acknowledging that God is the God of the sea. Verse 4, Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple, or yet I shall again pray towards Jerusalem. That phrase there, yet I shall again look, which is a hopeful phrase, could also be translated more as kind of a question. How shall I again look? In other words, the situation is so desperate, Jonah is wondering, how am I ever again going to be able to pray towards Jerusalem? So it just highlights really the desperateness that he's feeling here. Verse 5, the waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. Notice here in verse 6, we see the phrase again, went down. This is a continuation of the going down that we talked about in chapter 1 as Jonah moves closer and closer to death. The bars here are a reference to the gates of Sheol, or again, the gates of the realm of the dead. The pit is a reference to the realm of the dead. So this, in verse 6, is really Jonah hitting rock bottom. He's kind of at the end of his rope, which prompts verse 7. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Notice verse 4, he was hoping to be able to pray towards the earthly temple in Jerusalem, and now here we have Jonah's prayers reaching God's holy temple. Notice also in verse 7 what prompts this prayer. It says, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. And this is consistent with what he says prompted his prayer up in verse 2. He says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress. And so notice it was Jonah's turmoil that prompted his prayer. Notice he did not pray for the Ninevites when God said he had a message against them. He did not pray for the sailors. In fact, he didn't even pray for the sailors when they asked him to pray in verse 6 of chapter 1. And within this lengthy prayer in chapter 2, there is no mention of the sailors or the Ninevites, either one. Again, this is a selfish prayer for himself. Verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Notice then that verse 8 and 9 are kind of in contrast with one another. Verse 8 is kind of this dismissive attitude towards pagans. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love, contrasted with the boasting in verse 9, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. So another unique thing about verse 8 is that it's the only verse in this prayer that does not have a personal pronoun, I, me, or my. And so the only time that Jonah stops thinking about himself, he uses that time to take a cheap shot at pagans. Those who pay regard to vain idols will forsake their hope of steadfast love, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And that final phrase there, salvation belongs to the Lord, that's kind of Jonah's big claim here within this chapter, is that Jonah loves the salvation of the Lord, or perhaps more specifically, Jonah is very thankful for the salvation of the Lord. And remember, the big claim in chapter 1, the first time Jonah spoke in the narrative, was that he feared God. And everything about that narrative revealed that he did not actually fear God. And so we have here in Jonah chapter 2, the big claim that he is thankful for God's salvation, and we're going to see whether or not that bears out in the remaining chapters here of Jonah. Notice also what is glaringly absent from this prayer, which is a formal apology or repentance to God for his sin. There's no confession of sin. There's no repentance. Again, this is a selfish prayer prompted by Jonah feeling that he himself is in distress, which then causes him to claim that he loves and is thankful for the salvation of the Lord. Verse 10, and perhaps, and we saw this before, and perhaps now we'll see just a little bit of the humor in it. Verse 10, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. And it's not difficult to, or it's tempting to wonder if perhaps God and the fish both were a little bit sick to their stomach at this prayer, and then that led to the vomiting out onto dry land. Notice the fish's immediate obedience to God's command to vomit Jonah out. This is in contrast to Jonah's lack of obedience, because Jonah has yet to obey God and go to Nineveh. So even the fish is, at this point in the narrative, behaving better than Jonah. What will Jonah do now that he's out of the fish? What's going to happen to Nineveh? That's chapter 3.